it is an honor to receive this award named after Senator William Armstrong, whose leadership and bold witness for Christ we continue to benefit from today. Senator Armstrong championed self-government, fiscal responsibility, the rule of law, fundamental freedoms, and the importance of a Christian witness in the public square. His decision to live a life of service, not only in government, but to the next generation at Colorado Christian University, reminds us all that a life well lived is one with right priorities and one that follows God's call wherever that call may lead. What an example to all of us of how God blesses his faithful servants down to their children's children. So thank you for this honor, and Will and Christy, thank you for carrying on the Armstrong legacy. And thank you to the Western Conservative Summit for your commitment to equip Americans to continue to stand for faith, family, and freedom. Tonight, I want to begin by going behind the Iron Curtain in February of 1974. Alexander Solzhenitsyn had just been arrested by Soviet authorities, and as a world-famous dissident, he had spent 8 years in the Gulag. During that time, he had seen firsthand the cruelty and the oppression that defined communism. And as a writer, he devoted his life to exposing the truth at great risk to himself. But eventually, as a dissident, he became an unbearable threat to the Soviet regime. But for Solzhenitsyn, the deepest rot that he saw in the Soviet society wasn't just in the government. He actually said that it was the people who had tolerated that government and refused to critique it. And his critique went all the way down to the ordinary Russian on the street who put his head down, kept his mouth shut, and sometimes even gave voice to the lies of the Soviet regime. It was that man that Solzhenitsyn said had a lack of courage, and it was that man who gave an unconscionable gift to the Soviet regime and was in a deep form of slavery. On the eve of his exile, Solzhenitsyn left a parting letter to the Russian people, and his letter said, "We have so hopelessly ceded our humanity that for the modest handouts of today, we are ready to surrender up all principles, our soul, all the labors of our ancestors, and all the prospects of our descendants. Anything to avoid disrupting our meager existence." Solzhenitsyn's solution was simple: to stop aiding and abetting lies. This, he said, would not only rob the regime of its legitimacy, but more importantly, it would allow the people to live for something more noble, something higher, to live for truth, and even the creator of truth. There's a lot that's changed since 1974, but his prophetic words should ring in our ears today as we too face a growing tyranny of lies in our nation. Those lies don't just come from the government. We hear them from media, entertainment, academia, big tech, some of the most powerful corporations in the history of the world, and even the medical establishment. As an attorney, I see these lies making their way into the law. The lies tell us women can't be fulfilled or equal without aborting their children, that race defines us, it makes us innocent or guilty, and it must separate us, that marriage and the family are malleable, that they can be defined at will with absolutely no consequence to society, that men can become women and vice versa, because gender is based on feelings, not based on reality. Now we know that none of these lies stand up to reason or to science, which is why they have to rely on fear, public shaming, and cancel culture. But the challenge of Solzhenitsyn is here facing us today. The question is, will we too remain quiet? Will we too cede our humanity to avoid repercussions? Or instead, will we choose to stand on the timeless truths that have served this nation and humanity so well? G.K. Chesterton said, "Every high civilization decays by forgetting obvious things." But the thing about the truth is that it doesn't disappear just because we forget it. And when we ignore that truth, the lies that we affirm cause long-term harm to very real people and may, in fact, take generations to undo. That's why I joined Alliance Defending Freedom. ADF exists to advance the God-given right to be able to speak and live the truth. And we do that in courtrooms and legislatures and international tribunals and by training the next generation of Christian lawyers. And with God's help and the help of a broad alliance of groups and individuals, we've been able to prevail in 14 United States Supreme Court victories in the last 11 years, with hopefully the 15th coming in a few days. We hope. But the Alliance is also seeing progress in the state legislatures as well. In fact, nearly half of all states have now passed laws to protect student free speech on campuses, and 22 states have protected the rights of women and girls to fair play in sports. 18 states have taken some initial step to stop children from being traumatized and victimized by harmful and permanent medical transitions. And much of this has occurred in just the last several years. Together at ADF, we stand with you to protect and advance the truths that are facing the fiercest attack today. What are those, and why do we stand for them? Well, first, we protect the truth that life is sacred. Because God is the author of life, and every person made in his image is made with dignity and purpose. So we defend the sick, the elderly, the disabled, and yes, we defend the unborn. And we can never abandon God's ideal for marriage, which is a witness of the profound importance of a sacred union revealed in nature and in Scripture. And we all must continue to champion the family, because we remember that of the 3 God-ordained institutions that form the very foundation of human civilization, family, church, and government, what came first? The family. From the beginning, God ensured that it took a mother and a father to make a child. And we know that it's ideal when a mother and a father can raise that child together. And we know that every child is fearfully and wonderfully made as a boy or a girl, and that God makes no mistakes in what his hand creates. We also must defend the right to raise our children, to direct their upbringing, and that parental rights are fundamental rights under the Constitution. The relationship between the parent and the child is a living metaphor for the relationship between God and man. As President Reagan said, in the family, we learn our first lessons of God and man, of love and discipleship, of discipline, of rights and responsibilities, of human dignity and human frailty. And lastly, we must all protect free speech and religious freedom, because while evangelism and discipleship start at home, they can never end there. When people of faith are free to live out their faith in their word and their deed, the world becomes a more just and humane place, and that benefits people of all faiths and people of no faith. Throughout history, Americans, including Senator Armstrong, stood tall for these truths because they recognized that no nation could flourish if they deny them. So while our founders were not perfect, they established a First Amendment to ensure that we all have a voice to stand when timeless truths are tested. Coercion has never been the American remedy to bad ideas, but debate and persuasion have. What you may not know is that right now the United States is the last country in the free world that is resisting the type of censorship laws that are blanketing Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Let that sink in for a minute. We are the last country in the free world. This could be the last generation. Many nations guarantee rights like free speech in their written constitutions and governing documents. But those documents are no longer worth the paper they're written on because judicial interpretations, and in some cases an apathetic citizenry, have allowed them to be absolutely gutted. And we know that there are plenty here in the United States right now who are vigorously advocating for that same government censorship. So why is free speech coming under assault at this point in time? Well, we all know there are many reasons, and you've heard many of them this weekend. But perhaps the biggest one is that the ideology that has so co-opted many of the most powerful institutions simply cannot abide the truth. It's an ideology based on a lie. It says that we should look inside rather than outside ourselves to determine what's right and wrong, what's true and false, that we can determine that any disagreement with one's self-perception can't be tolerated and must be silenced. But we need to understand that this way of thinking is fundamentally incompatible with free speech and religious freedom. Think about it. If the right to be affirmed in one's feelings is ultimate, then it becomes a super right that supersedes all other interests and rights, even those that are enumerated in our Constitution. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, once said, "Liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That, of all rights, is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power." Silencing voices we disagree with and forcing people to affirm ideas that they believe is wrong, well, that's a tool used by tyrants and failed nations, not our country. They hate free speech because ideas are shared primarily through words, and you know what? Words are powerful. They reveal truth, they expose lies, they win hearts and minds, they hold governments accountable. They can change the course of history. Which is why we must never stay quiet when the truth is at stake. We must be tenacious and we must be bold. And notice I said bold, but not belligerent, because there's a difference. But if we are bold and we commit to the truth, we can change the law and the culture for our generation. And I want to tell you about a few examples tonight of individuals like yourself who have done just that. First, my favorite firefighter, Kelvin Cochran. Chief Cochran is a decorated public servant who served as the U.S. Fire Administrator, the highest position, firefighting position in the United States. And he later became Fire Chief of Atlanta. But in his extra time, he sought to help other men become good husbands and fathers. And as part of that calling, he wrote and distributed a men's devotional Bible, which has impacted that devotional study many, many lives. A few pages in his book appropriately address the biblical sexual ethic. And for that, the city of Atlanta put him on leave and launched an investigation. What did they find? Absolutely nothing. They found that Chief Cochran had never discriminated against anyone. So what did they do? They fired him because of his beliefs. Recognizing what was at stake and the precedent that could be set for men like Chief Cochran, he challenged the city in court, not just to protect himself, but to let the city know that it does not have the power to censor and punish someone because of their religious beliefs. And he won. And then there's my favorite student, Jack Denton. Jack served as president of the Student Senate at Florida State University, and he participated in the Catholic Student Union. When someone urged Catholic students in a private text message group to support groups like the ACLU and BLM.org, Jack kindly and winsomely shared how those organizations held views that were at odds with the Catholic faith. For merely voicing those views in a private conversation, Jack endured a 7-hour struggle session where students berated him at a hearing, and he was eventually stripped of his role as president. If you're wondering, did this violate the Constitution? Let me assure you it did. Jack was told by some, though, that he shouldn't stand up for his constitutional rights, that it might hurt his Christian witness, or it might hurt others in campus, or it might make the school angry with him. But Jack also knew that the opposite was true, that if he didn't stand for his rights and the rights of others, more would suffer. I'm pleased to share that he successfully sued and he won. But not only that, because of his stand, the Florida legislature heard about what happened to him, and they passed a law strengthening free speech rights on state campuses, meaning that future students would have more recourse than Jack did, all because he made a courageous stand. And several of the students who most vocally opposed him later apologized to him after hearing and watching Jack through the ordeal. And many of you know about one other Jack, Masterpiece Cake Shop owner Jack Phillips. He happily serves all customers, but as a Christian, he asks for the freedom that everyone else has to simply be able to create custom messages consistent with his beliefs. But 11 years ago, can you believe it's been that long? 11 years ago, Colorado sued him. And in the course of his litigation, they stripped him of family income. He lost most of his employees. The state ordered him to re-educate his employees, which were his family members, teaching them that he was wrong to operate his business consistent with his faith. And then it required him to submit quarterly reports every time he decided to decline to create a custom cake. Your government at work. Thankfully, we won Jack's case 7-2 at the Supreme Court, but the court decided that case based on the clear and impermissible hostility of Colorado. They literally compared his beliefs to those held by slave owners and perpetrators of the Holocaust. But they didn't decide the free speech issue, and that means the harassment hasn't stopped. On the day the Supreme Court agreed to hear Jack's case, an activist attorney called Jack and asked him to design a custom cake with blue on the outside and pink on the inside to celebrate this attorney's transition. He then later called and asked Jack to design a custom cake with Satan on it. Jack politely declined both. And 3 weeks after we won the case at the United States Supreme Court, Colorado filed charges against Jack again. Now again, we uncovered hostility through the discovery process that forced the state to drop the case. But that activist attorney continued, and Jack remains in litigation to this day. In fact, he's asking the Colorado Supreme Court to take up his case. And the attorney has vowed that he will continue to litigate until he wins, and that he wants to change Jack's views. Like Jack, Baronelle Stutzman from Washington State served all customers who came through her doors, including serving a longtime friend and customer for nearly 10 years. She declined one event, his same-sex wedding. For this, she was sued not only in her business, but personally. This is without even a complaint by the customer. It put virtually everything she had at risk. Baronelle could have easily walked away, but she didn't. And over the next 10 years, God used this woman to stand in media, to stand before legislatures, to stand on college campuses and debates, to stand for her faith and the right of free speech. And in an ending that only God could orchestrate, after nearly a decade in court and at 77 years old, Baronelle was finally able to retire with her conscience intact as well as her pocketbook. Her persistent courage kept the issue alive in the courts until she could pass the baton to a young woman who was inspired by her and Jack's example. And that is Lori Smith. Lori runs her own design studio, 303 Creative, right here in Denver. She specializes in graphic and website design. And Lori wanted to expand her portfolio to create websites that celebrate marriage between a man and a woman. But we already know what Colorado's position is on that. The state said Lori would break the law if she failed to create websites celebrating same-sex weddings. And she saw from how aggressively they prosecuted Jack that she needed to challenge the law. I had the privilege of arguing her case in December, and as I said, any week now we expect the court to rule. And like Jack and Baronelle, Lori serves everyone who comes into her store, including those who identify as LGBT. Anyone who seeks to have a project that aligns with her views, she carefully considers and joyously engages with. She decides what speech to create based on what the speech is, not who the person is that's requesting it. So we're praying for a strong ruling from the court, because free speech is for everyone, whether you agree with Lori, Jack, and Baronelle, or you take the opposite view. Hopefully these stories remind us all that God gives us courage in unexpected moments, and that we're all called to cultivate and protect faith, family, and freedom. And they also remind us, I hope, to play the long game. In the Dobbs case that overturned Roe v. Wade, we have the privilege of helping draft that Mississippi legislation and litigating that case, serving on Mississippi's legal team with them. But that ruling was a part of a vast coordinated effort that involved hundreds of people: lawyers, officials, scientists, medical experts, policy, political, and public advocacy groups. And all of it, every last bit of it, was built on a foundation of 2 generations of Americans, many of you who are sitting here today. People who prayed, who marched, who stood, who ministered in pregnancy resource centers, who stood outside sidewalk counselors to minister to people in need. People who advocated that we can do better as a nation, and that nothing in the Constitution includes a constitutional right to abortion. And now we know that the fight continues, right? State by state, neighborhood by neighborhood, family by family. But we must continue to fight for our laws to empower women and to protect the dignity of all life. And I'll close with one last story. Lydia Booth was 9 years old during the pandemic when she wore a mask to school that said, "Jesus loves me." Her teachers told her she had to take it off, that it violated the school policy, even though other students in the school were wearing messages on their masks as well. Lydia had bold parents who hired some bold lawyers, and after a long ordeal back and forth, they helped her win back her right to wear a Jesus Loves Me mask to school. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that precedent, it's not a very big case. It's not going to make a splash. It won't be felt around the world. But it sure made a difference for Lydia. She was never much of a risk taker before, her mom said, but she is now. And it made a difference to the more than 1,000 people that heard her story, that said they were inspired and they too would stand up for free speech. It made a difference to all the children who asked to have masks just like hers, and it made a difference to the students and the teachers who read the message on those masks. And it's made Lydia even more sure that when she grows up, she wants to be a missionary, to go help people, to tell them about Jesus, even though, as her dad tells her, she's already a pretty good missionary. I wonder how many people were impacted by Lydia's courage when they felt isolated in that moment. I also wonder how many people will find their way into heaven, because God used a very unpleasant experience for a little Lydia Booth, teaching her to be bold and stand for her faith. I'm not asking you today to run for office or to testify before the school board, although I think some of you should. And I'm not asking you today to file a lawsuit, although some of you, I guarantee, will need to. But what I want to emphasize is, more often than not, we have opportunities to bravely speak truth in our hallway conversations, in our water coolers, in the boardroom, in the school pickup line, at the end of our driveways with our neighbors. And one of the most challenging places is at the dinner table with our kids. May we not delegate that responsibility. So I close with Solzhenitsyn's challenge. Don't live by lies, speak the truth. And as Jesus said, take the narrow path. There's no profit in gaining the world if we lose our soul. Tonight, there are 2 people here that have made the right choice, and they have, for 2 combined decades, fought the fight, counted the cost, and they're heroes to me. They fought for my freedom. They fought for your freedom and everyone's. They've taken the narrow path. Denver's own Lori Smith and Jack Phillips, would you please join me?